Does Christ escape history, or does he conquer it? Nothing of significance happened in AD 500. Absolutely nothing of significance happened in AD 500. Contrary to the expectations of Sextus Julius Africanus, a Christian historian of 2 centuries before that, and of his premillennial readers in 500 AD. Africanus did a lot of work. He mixed Hebrew, Greek, and Persian chronologies to find out when the end of the world was going to come. He came to the conclusion that the creation week happened 5,500 years before the birth of Christ. The incarnation, he believed, happened on the first day, March 25th, of the year 5501 of the creation. His eschatology was premillennial, so he expected the second coming of Christ to establish his kingdom. He calculated 5 millennia from the creation to the Babylonian captivity, another 500 years to the birth of Christ, believing that the history of the world will only last 7,000 years. With a final period of 1,000 years reign of Christ, Africanus predicted the second coming to be in the year 6,000 of the creation, that is, year 500 of the incarnation. After that, the millennium, and then in the year 1500 of the incarnation, the end of history. Nothing happened in AD 500. Absolutely nothing. The Western Roman Empire was dead, and yet there was no room for pessimism. Just 4 years before the predicted end of the world, in AD 496, Clovis, the king of the Franks, had converted to Christianity. Christianity was strong everywhere, including in the Aryan barbaric kingdoms of Spain and Italy, which had strong Christian majorities. Ireland, a formerly pagan land of constantly warring clans, was converted by St. Patrick. Christian missionaries were exploring the deep forests of the German lands. Northern Africa was producing fine Christian rulers and theologians. In the West, there was no paganism of significance to talk about anymore. The pagan Roman Empire was a thing of the past after Augustine destroyed the last intellectual resistance of its diminishing band of apologists. Pagan barbarians were falling back before other barbarians who now were armed with the faith and the optimism of their new faith in Christ. The faith was not a Greek or Latin enterprise anymore. The Celts, the Germans, the Saxons took it over, the Franks, and continued converting other pagans. In the east, the empire of the city of Constantine was pushing back its borders again, but this time using the cross more than it used the sword. Emperors officially bowed before Christ, and they even minted coins where Christ was this big and the emperor was this big. The empire had new laws about almost everything, from abortion and slavery to monetary policies and economic regulations. And there was a new factor in that new process of legislation: Christ and His Word. Learning to apply it was still a process. Nothing happened overnight. But the old days of public deification of political rulers were no more. Christ was the only God, whether for individuals or for their families or for their society. Nothing happened in AD 500. But actually something very profound happened in AD 500. Of the competing paradigms about history, only one remained valid and legitimate. Going back in history, the pagan paradigm, and we're going to talk about it later today, had no life left in it. We're going to talk about the fact that pagans are afraid of the future. They always want to go back in history. They always want to stop history so that history doesn't move forward. The other paradigm, going out of history, the premillennial paradigm, self-destructed in the non-event of AD 500. Only the Christian, post-millennial, optimistic, activist paradigm was now reigning unchallenged in the church, going forward in history. What 200 years earlier sounded like a joke that Christianity would survive in AD 500 was the inevitable fate of humanity. No one could imagine anything else. For another 500 years, until probably AD 1000, no other pagan or premillennial or heretical paradigm arose to challenge it. Even when militarily the Christian world was losing the battle against Islam, when the only obstacle before the total annihilation of Christianity was Charles Martel's bulwark of ice on that hill in France at Poitiers in AD 732, Christian ministers and theologians preached and taught the Regnum Christi, the kingdom of Christ, and its ultimate victory in history. It was an amazing time in which nobody could even imagine that Christianity could lose in history. We seldom today go back to that part of our history of the church. Somehow our Christian history is important enough when we go back to the early church. We think we can learn from the early church, no matter how tainted it was by heresies. The Antichrist John was writing about in his epistles were not political rulers far in the future. There were people in his time, if you read carefully what he is talking about, the Antichrist, those were heretics of his time. And no matter how poor its practical living was, Jesus Christ is talking in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 about really, really poor practices, moral practices of the churches at the time. We still think that the early church is so important, and it is in a certain way. But we have this strange idea that only a church that is visibly under persecution is a true church and we can learn from it. But if it's a victorious church that has achieved victory in history, it somehow doesn't deserve our attention. A church that is actually in the process of building a Christian civilization doesn't deserve our attention. A church that has just defeated a pagan empire and is actively working to bring the gospel to the nations outside of the borders of that empire, converting barbarians by rates unimaginable to us today, doesn't deserve our attention. We ignore the examples of evangelistic success in history, and guess what? And then we wonder why we don't have success today. We ignore the biblical examples of the heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11, and especially the verses where it says that the acts of the faith that they performed were conquering kingdoms, dispensing justice, turning armies to flight. And then we wonder why we're lacking those heroes of the faith today. And worst of all, we ignore the historical beliefs of those who were victorious in the faith and created our civilization today. And we lament the fact that we're being defeated today. Of those historical beliefs, the most important that we ignore and reject and malign is the view of history of those old heroes of the faith. There is something back in history that we lack today. There is this view of history which we're rejecting today, and especially Christ's place in history. Earlier this year, I argued in an article for the Faith for All Life magazine that the debate about eschatology that we have had in the last 100 years has revolved around the wrong ideas. In general, we have assumed that eschatology is a study of when millennium is going to be. That's what we like to argue about, and especially its temporal relation to the coming of Christ. Okay, that's how we describe our eschatologies. Premillennialism is what? Coming of Christ, pre or before the millennium, right? And then we have postmillennialism, that is the coming of Christ post or after the millennium, and of course amillennialism, which is there is no earthly millennium. Now, these descriptions do make sense as technical descriptions, but I'm afraid their use may be a little misleading. For the reality is that the nature of our eschatological systems has more to do with the covenantal status of the church in this age. And I want to emphasize the covenantal status of the church in this age. The church in the Bible is described as the bride of Christ. My thesis was that the difference between the eschatological systems is in how they view the church in its relation, in her position in relation to Christ as her husband. Let me explain it in short. I'm not going to read the whole article. Dispensationalism of course, believe that racial Israel is the true bride of Christ. Right? The history after the resurrection of Christ has been a parenthesis, brackets, an unplanned for period forced upon Christ because of his rejection by the Jewish nation. But his plans, of course, are to restore Israel as his true bride back to himself at the end of history and rule with Israel on the earth for 1,000 years. What does that make the church? The church is only a temporary consort, a concubine to Christ. You see that? A temporary consort that he takes while his wife is whoring out with other husbands. He's taking the church as a temporary wife just to drive his true bride to jealousy, and then, at the end of time, restore his true wife to him. The church is not getting, like a true concubine, second-rate wife. She's not getting the full inheritance. Israel is getting it. But the church is going to be rewarded in some way. And meanwhile, even in this age, dispensationalists believe that the church is supposed to serve and honor the adulterous wife no matter what, which means the state of Israel. Amillennialism and historical premillennialism believe that the church is the bride of Christ, but not yet. She's a sort of a fiancée, or a sort of a girlfriend, rather. She's still not in his house, not in his home. She doesn't have the full authority of a wife over his property, which is the whole world. She's not allowed to do anything in this world that will create any material difference in this world, because if she's not his wife, she doesn't have any authority over his household yet. The true concern of the fiancée or of a betrothed girl is purity, right? And that's the main concern of amillennialism and historical premillennialism, purity. So she's just keeping herself pure until that glorious day when she will become his wife. Postmillennialism, on the other hand, believes that she is fully his wife here today. There's no future event that postmillennialists expect that would in some way bring the church closer to her position as a wife. I mean, there's going to be the last judgment. It will change the world, will purge it from sin, but it won't change the legal status of the church to a higher legal status. The church is Christ's bride here and now in history and on earth. And she is fully responsible as his wife to administer Christ's world as his property. And through his word and his spirit to clean it from curse and imperfection as much as possible before Christ comes. That full ownership and full responsibility is expressed in Paul's words to the Corinthians and is taken very seriously by all postmillennialists. And I'm reading from 1 Corinthians 3:21 through 23. For all things belong to you. You hear that? All things belong to you. When you marry your wife, all things in your house belong to her. Unless you look at her as a concubine, which is not the biblical way to look at her. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, all things belong to you, and you belong to Christ, just like your wife belongs to you, and Christ belongs to God. A legal wife here and now, the church owns all things together with her husband in history now, because Paul is speaking to his listeners about now. All things now belong to you. She's expected to take charge as the virtuous wife of Proverbs 31. What does the virtuous wife of Proverbs 31 do? She's waiting for her husband to do something, right? No, he is in the gates. He doesn't even know what's going on home. He comes back home and he looks around and he says, wow, you're a great wife. Her husband is in the gates, sitting as a judge of the world. She is over his property, bringing all things to obey the household rules, which, as we saw today, are the law of God. Of course, there is still sin in the world. There are pockets of disorder in every household, and even the most perfect woman has to work hard to bring order to it. But the church brings her husband's rule to every corner of his property. And this is the meaning of history. To every area of life, and in the process of history, through the Spirit and the Word, destroys every pocket of disorder, sin, and curse. That's what postmillennialism believes. That's where postmillennial optimism comes from. It's not so much because we have made the calculations, because calculations don't matter. What matters is, what is the covenantal status of the wife? This is what my thesis was in that article. But what I didn't mention in that article is that there is a much deeper consequence of each of those respective views that I described. And that consequence is based on the biblical principle that the church is, according to Ephesians 1, what? The fullness of Christ. Of course, representatively, but she is the fullness of Christ. The covenant status of the wife in the family presupposes that she can be a fully empowered representative of her husband, fully authorized representative of her husband. For all practical and legal purposes, a husband was present legally where his wife was present and where her decisions had any consequence. In fact, what is less known today in America, I don't know, it's probably known here, the official address of married women in the English-speaking world is by the name of their husband, right? For example, Phil Cox's wife will be Mrs. Phil Cox. Do you all know where that came from? Where that came from was from the old city councils in the past, when men were expected to have to spend at least 2 years on the sea. That means that they couldn't participate in the local town councils, but their wives were fully empowered to vote and make decisions as their proxies to those councils. So when the tally of the councils was taken, they would read the names. So they would say, Stephen Perks, hi, Mr. Stephen Perks. They would say Phil Cox, and his wife will say Mrs. Phil Cox. And her vote was counted as if his vote. And if he didn't like his wife's vote, it was his responsibility. He offered her marriage in the first place. She was fully empowered. The pagan world never knew of such role of the wife. In the pagan world, the wife was simply an addendum to the family, a servant, not one flesh with her husband, and therefore not his legal representative. For example, you can read Fustel de Coulanges. He's a Swiss author of the book was written in 1860-something, but it is still, I think you can still find copies of it, called The Ancient City. A very important study of the ancient pagan families. But if the wife is a fully empowered representative of the husband, and if the husband is legally present everywhere where the wife is making any decisions, then the church as a real wife represents Christ in history. And therefore, Christ not only didn't leave history, he actually got directly involved in history through his representative, through his bride. He said in John 14, I will go and prepare an abiding place for you. Now, it is generally accepted today that he was talking about their place in heaven. But there is a very interesting twist to the whole story there, because the word for abiding place is a very unique Greek word. It is not used anywhere else in the New Testament except in the same chapter later in a verse that says, my Father and I will come and make an abiding place in you. There's absolutely no other place where that specific word is used. And in other places you can see the word for house, for settlement, for living place, and so on. But this specific word is not used in any other place. Only 2 times in this specific chapter. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And then a few verses later saying, my Father and I will come and prepare that abiding place in you. Jesus was not telling them that he was leaving history to prepare for them a place outside of history. And that place outside of history should be the focus of their work and hopes and enthusiasm. He was telling them that he was going just for a little while, only to return almost immediately and establish his own presence in history through them, through his church. That's what he was telling them. And if the church is here in this world, working in history, then Christ has not left history. And which is more, Christ has a much bigger goal than just saving people out of history. The pagan idea and the premillennial idea that we're either going back in history or we're going out of history is not present in any of the verses in any of the words of Jesus Christ. His bigger goal is to conquer history. In my talks to amillennialists and premillennialists, I have often pointed to the fact that postmillennialism is optimistic about history, and the other two are pessimistic. I get objection from both and premillennialists, and that objections are that this is not true, that these guys are also optimistic. So I asked them, how are you optimistic? The reply invariably is that we're optimistic about the end of our journey, when we will be with Jesus and be freed from this world. What is happening in between is not present in their answer. There is this temporal leap between now and the far future, and everything in between is a parenthesis. It doesn't matter. History doesn't matter for them. They can't even begin to think about history because history has no meaning, except as something that is to be avoided, something to escape from, just as Christ, according to them, escaped history in his resurrection and ascension. And in fact, that is the way most Christians today look at Christ's ascension, as if in his ascension he escaped history. The ascension of Christ is not the enthronement of a king. It is kind of a return of a temporary exile home. Indeed, you can often hear claims that we're, those beautiful words, we're royal exiles on the earth from many pastors. That we're constantly mourning by the rivers of Babylon, expecting, longing for our return home. You know, history is a place of captivity, you know. A place that the only good thing you can do about it is to escape from it, to leave it. That is a Gnostic view that views our spirits as trapped into our bodies and into history, instead of seeing our bodies as a tools of God for his dominion over history. That exactly was Africanus' mistake. As bright as he was, he had a very incorrect view of history. The problem wasn't that he entered incorrect data in his calculations, and the problem wasn't that he made mistakes in doing the calculations. The whole enterprise of calculating the end of the world was a serious blunder. Actually, a sinful activity, if you ask me, influenced by his pagan beliefs, and it should never have been done. He saw history as a mere interlude between eternities, a short blip without any covenantal, any salvific significance in God's plan for humanity. It had no meaning in itself. The only meaning of history for him was its end. Whatever was in history could be safely ignored. All that mattered was the end of history. And if all that mattered was the end of history, then counting the time to the end of history was the only important thing to do. And I'm hoping you're making parallels to modern preachers while I'm saying this. And focusing on history in our battle in history was something that we shouldn't do. An exile longs for his return home, and he counts the days to his return. When our theology turns us into exiles, it will necessarily make us only count the days and try to guess the day of the end of history. I was asked about the phrase lining up on the bus stop to heaven. That's what's happening today. That idea about royal exiles is incorrect. It is taken from a wrong interpretation of 1 Peter 1:1. The word for exile in Greek is metokos, and it means someone who was cast out, usually for political reasons, from his homeland, and he lives in a foreign land and is longing for his return. But that word is never used in the New Testament about Christians. It is not used in the New Testament at all. The word that is used and translated incorrectly as exile is parepidemos. And the true meaning of the word parepidemos is sojourner. And in fact, a settler. Somebody who voluntarily left for another land to settle there, to live among strangers with the meaning of conquering it. The original settlers in the American colonies would be parepidemi, wouldn't be metoki. Christians are here not because we have been cast from heaven, temporarily inhabiting a place that doesn't belong to us, longing to return. We are sojourners, settlers, conquerors who live among a wicked generation, not to whine about it, but to conquer it in the name of Christ. Not to be silent and docile and waiting to be taken out of here, but to work towards the day when they will be taken out of here, according to the parable in Matthew 13. We know our days. Nothing of significance happened in 1988, despite the 88 reasons to believe why the rapture will be in 88. I told the story of earlier today to a group of gentlemen that one of my elders had an idea to publish a book, 00 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 00. Just he missed the chance to do it. Nothing of significance happened in 1996 either, exactly 6,000 years after the creation week, according to the chronology of Bishop Usher. Nothing of significance happened in 2000, 2012, in 2013. The church today just passed another quote-unquote African period. That is the period of Africanuses who promised us the end of the world. Just within a few years, this generation for sure. I promise. May or October. Oh, made a mistake. It's going to be in December. Nothing of significance happened, and yet something of a great significance happened. We are approaching a period when that old pagan view of history, which has crept into our church as premillennialism, lost its attraction. People are discovering more and more that going out of history is a false hope. Going back to the past is impossible. For as we see today, the world is spinning out of control for those who want to go back to the past. The only system of thought about the meaning of history that remains now on its feet, even though it has very few adherents in the church today, is that system which establishes Christ as King of history and therefore as intimately involved in history through his church. Going out has lost credibility. Going back is impossible. The only option we have today is going forward. The idea that Christ conquers history would be a revolutionary idea for our modern churches. Our evangelism today, though, must be based on it, because without it, there's no alternative. Everything else has failed. So our goal today is to restore that preaching that declares Christ as the conqueror of history, and therefore his church as conqueror of history. Thank you.